Okay, kia ora koutou. Ko Victoria Easton tōku ingoa. I am Head of Sector Development, Pau Whakahaere for National Services Te Parangi here at Te Papa. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Zoom hui focused on permissions. I'm really grateful that we have two very learned presenters today with lots of experience and expertise to be able to share with us. So welcoming Catriona McPherson, who is Rights Manager here at Papa, and Melanie Lovell-Smith, who is the Digitisation Advisor at National Library. A reminder for everybody just to please keep themselves on mute. We will have opportunity for a Q&A. Please, you can ask questions at any time via chat, or I'll open up the floor after our presentations. A reminder also to everybody that we are recording, so if you would like to not appear in the video, then please keep yourself on, turn your camera off. Okay. I'll start with karakia, and then we're going to hand over to Catriona. Tēnei au, te hāpai nei, e tiri nei, e paupau nei, e tōku reo, mō tōku mana, mō tōku ihi, te māpihi mauria, kia mau, kia ita, haumie, huie, tāki.
Tāki.
Kia ora. All right, so Catriona, handing over to you.
Kia ora. I will just get my screen sorted, which is always a fun one. Let's see. Oh, we're a slide too early. There we are. Kia ora koutou, ko Catriona McPherson tōku ingoa. I'm Catriona, the Rights Manager at Te Papa, as Victoria has kindly said. And my role here is responsible for ensuring Te Papa is well placed to achieve effective use, reuse, repurposing and re-imaging of Te Papa's content, as well as leading the management of intellectual property, providing advice to Te Papa in the sector, and managing a team of two. We have a media and image researcher and a rights officer. I'm going to make a bit of an assumption here that some of you already know the basics of copyright, including how long it lasts. But generally speaking, copyright duration is a pretty lengthy thing, which does mean that we can be seeking permission from the original maker, their immediate descendants, or in some cases, generations far removed from their original creator. We can also assume that in most cases, the original maker did not consider copyright when wrapping up their will or their estate. Not handy for us. Before I launch into how the process of getting permission, I thought it would be best to consider how Te Papa's workflow for assessing and clearing collection items kind of goes. We first generally determine whether or not permission is needed by assessing if copyright still exists. And then you can see if copyright doesn't exist, we go through a process of releasing these images under a no known copyright statement or a Creative Commons license. Of course, if the work is determined to be in copyright, there are kind of two eventualities. We either license the work or we consider an orphan, and we'll go into those in a little bit. Now, most of you will probably use the general rule of creator plus 50, the death of the creator plus 50 years to determine copyright duration. But you may not be aware that there can be different durations for the different types of work and also when the work was created and who created the work. Now, this is a plug for the wonderful Victoria Leachman, who actually developed this copyright duration flowchart of death. And it's a handy document which we can make available after the session, and it covers most of the eventualities you would ever come across when dealing with collections and assessing those collections. I will warn you, this is page 1 of 10. It's definitely not for the faint-hearted, but can get down to some of those really nitty-gritty situations, like when a work was jointly created, or perhaps when a work was commissioned or made under as part of someone's employment. So copyright licensing. If you've determined that you need to actually license a work or get permission, this is the kind of flowchart or process that you might go through for that. I love this because it kind of gives a false sense of the realities of what licensing can actually look like. The reality probably looks a little bit more like this. But the general process is quite straightforward enough, and it is broken down into different steps. The first one will be to research and identify the copyright holder, then locate the copyright holders and contact information, send out any correspondence in terms of licensing, negotiate terms if you need to, and then countersign the license to kind of wrap everything up. While the process can look straightforward, each section does come with its own issues, setbacks, or eventual dead ends, and we'll get onto those dead ends in a little bit. But where do you even start to look? Now, I know that Melanie is going to cover off some really good resources later, but just as a very brief overview, there's nothing like a good Google search to start off your investigation into someone. Just make sure you use things like quotation marks around names or refine by location if you have an idea of where that person may have been situated. Another great place is other GLAM institutions, both within New Zealand and internationally, who hold and have actually published images of works by the same maker. They're a really good starting point and generally really happy to share contact information of copyright holders or provide an introduction. Quite often with international collections, they're more likely to pass on a license you've developed. Births, deaths, marriages and probates, which are basically wills online, will provide you with death dates of someone and possibly the name of the person who inherited the estate. What you will find when you're looking at wills is that generally copyright isn't included as a kind of specific asset that was handed down to someone, but it's usually covered in that general wrap-up of someone's estate. Now, because copyright can be transferred or inherited, papers pass and obituaries online can give you great hints on relationships and potential copyright holders. So generally, you know, a spouse that's still living or children may have inherited that or be able to point you in the direction of someone that can help you. I also find that the New Zealand Companies Register will provide you with the name and address of the director of a company. Now, that's really helpful if you're dealing with manufactured goods. They can be really hard. It's usually because it was done under an employment contract. The employer will be the one that holds copyright. And of course, the trusty white pages, something we don't use very often in our everyday life these days, but they can still drum up names, especially of our kind of older generations. You just may be faced with a few cold calls to various John Smiths until you get the right one. At Te Papa, we have a bit of a checklist for avenues of research, and we can send that out after the Zui for you to also use. Once you've located your copyright holder, well done, by the way, you're going to want to negotiate a license to allow you to reproduce the item. When most people start out licensing, it really can be a daunting task, given the variety and number of works you might be dealing with, especially if this is your first kind of avenue to licensing. So it is a good idea to prioritize your collection. Te Papa uses a few criteria when we start thinking about what we're going to do next. The major ones are we think about use. Have we got an exhibition coming up that's going to be using this content? Have we got blogs or a major event or anniversaries? Do we have a huge number of works by that creator? If we've got an artist with hundreds of works, we're going to be more definitely keen to get a license out for those. We also like to check whether or not the information is already available in collections online or on our collection management system, and also check whether or not the work has been photographed. One of our biggest areas that we try to keep up to date with as much as possible is our new acquisitions, and this is because what we found is people want to use what's new. It's always that shiny new object that people want to talk about in our marketing. We do see about a 60% return rate on our licenses within the first 3 months, but have been known to have licenses returned after 10 years. And sometimes we don't hear back at all. So it's really important not to get disheartened if you don't hear back immediately. Perseverance is really key with licensing, even if that means sending a follow-up email after 6 months. Quite often people will receive a license and they might just sit on it for a little bit. They may not understand it, and that follow-up email will prompt them to ask questions that they may not have done in that first kind of interaction. Just remember to get it in writing wherever possible. Now, in some situations, that's not always going to be the case. If you do come across those situations, what's the best practice to do is actually to note down the conversation you've had with the rights holder and then send them a copy of that conversation. You may not receive anything back from them, but at least you've done your due diligence to at least communicate what your understanding was. I also like to think that it's really important to remain consistent with your licensing. That way, when you have a license for any work, you generally know what it's going to cover, and you don't have to always keep going back to the terms and conditions. And it's also important to kind of keep it broad. Don't just cover the use you immediately think of, like a collections online or a blog post or use in your exhibition that's coming up, but try to future-proof this as much as possible. You never know what you might want to do in the future or what technology might become available to you. Te Papa's standard license generally covers the following non-commercial uses, including things like exhibiting copies of the work. That's for situations where we might not be able to display the original, like if we want to use it in a graphic panel. Making documentary copies of the work, so that's more for things like in our museum records or administration purposes. Reproducing the works in museum publications, so that's things like our brochures or promotional material, supplying to media, education and public programs resources, and then also use online in our websites, social media, or electronic guides. Now, we try to keep this consistent across our collection licensing, but also with our model releases, if we take photos of people in the museum, and also when we seek externally supplied content. Now, there are always going to be exceptions to the rules. There are copyright holders who are going to have their own demands, perhaps where they want copies of printed works or special acknowledgements. Just make sure that in these cases, you note down what those exceptions are so that you can adhere to them when they do pop up. And I will note that Te Papa also generally avoids commercial licensing as part of our general licensing. We feel this makes it a little bit more appealing for our copyright holders to sign, but also it's easier sometimes to deal with commercial licensing on a case-by-case basis. But you may want to think about that when you're doing your licensing, especially if you charge entrance to your institution or if you charge for things like public programs or education resources. It wouldn't be a copyright conversation if we didn't include something about Creative Commons. So I will just say that you can also consider adding Creative Commons options into your licensing. These are great because they allow not only for your organisation to reuse the content, but also for the public to reuse them, obviously within the terms of those licenses. Of course, once you start researching and licensing, you might want to think about where you're going to record all of this information. You might, like Te Papa, have a great collection management system which has inbuilt systems, but alternatively, if you're just looking for a quick and easy way, a handy Excel spreadsheet is always the way to go. This is a kind of template one, which kind of gives you an overview of the things that are really good to start tracking. So things like a thumbnail for easy identification, your registration or unique number, the object details, so things like title, maker, production date, copyright status, iwi clearance status, if you know that it's a provenance taonga and want to include iwi relationships with the reuse of those. And then, of course, your permissions name, contact, and email address. I also like to link the license information if possible. Now, if you're saving them electronically, that's usually easy. But if you're saving them physically, you might want to note down the file number or where it's going to be stored in your institution. A rights statement if it's going up online, and then also the handiest one is the notes field. This is especially helpful if you've got multiple people adding information to the document, because you can always keep track of where you are in the process. This is an example of Te Papa's. We're really fortunate. Our collection management system, EMU, is really able to assess we're able to track our assessment, research and licensing process. This is a really interesting example because it's one of our only ones that shows all the different types of rights that we actually track. So this is an item that is a photograph of a work by Brian Brake. So we have the copyright statement, which is, and then the license for the Brian Break element. We have a reproduction license for the taonga, which is actually held by the Auckland Museum, and a license. And then we have our cultural permissions included there as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are going to be situations where you come to a dead end. And when this happens, we refer to them as orphans. I don't mean this poor little orphan sloth, who, by the way, is living. Someone thought it was dead when I put it up online earlier. I was a little, so it is alive. But what I also actually mean by orphans is what happens when you're unable to determine if a work is still in copyright. You're able to determine the work is still in copyright, but you can't find the copyright holder. Museums are inevitably faced with a large portion of their collections where the maker or production date of collection items are unknown, and tracing potential copyright holders is impossible. There are also objects that, despite knowing who the original maker is, the copyright holder can't be traced. And these objects are referred to as orphaned works. But what's an orphan? How does one become one? And what are the risks for GLAM institutions faced when reproducing orphaned works? Now, an orphaned work is a work which is protected by copyright, but whose rights owner or owners cannot be identified or located. Now, reproducing an orphaned work without permission is in breach of New Zealand's copyright laws, but when this impacts a large portion of institutions' collections, it can have huge bearings on what the public is able to see of that collection. Classifying a collection item as orphaned isn't always a straightforward process either, nor is it one that's really approached lightly by GLAM institutions. And our current legislation has no provision for orphaned works. So we are left to make up our own decisions. And really that's based around assessment of risk, appropriate mitigation strategies, and general experience. Te Papa has about 60,000 collection items that are considered orphans, and to remove these from our collections online or exhibitions or in publications would greatly alter the visual spectrum of our museum and retrospective collections. So how do we approach the situation? Te Papa has developed policies to ensure when orphaned works are reproduced, there was a significant search conducted to seek the copyright holder. We call this due diligence. There is also a risk mitigation policy or process in place should the copyright holder come forth and identify themselves. Now, this due diligence to find copyright holders isn't regulated across GLAM institutions, even though most of us do that. But essentially, we endeavour to justify our actions should a copyright holder come forth. Now, for some collection items, due diligence could be just a simple Google search, which presented no results. And for others, it might have a huge list of research avenues, including inquiries to births, death, marriages, probates records, lists of unanswered mail, phone calls, and endless inquiries to other organisations. The important factor with due diligence is to make sure that all potential avenues are searched and that the inquiries are recorded. It's also important to assess the risk. Now, this will differ from institution to institution, and in some cases, when one orphan is going to be considered low risks, others might be considered higher. And this is why it's important to assess the use each and every time you reuse an orphan work. For example, reproducing an orphan as part of collections online is relatively low risk. If a copyright holder came forth, it's easy to remove the content, and it can be done quickly and usually without financial implications. But something like a printed publication has a higher risk, as the entire publication might need to be removed from circulation and then possibly reprinted at the cost of the institution. And then, of course, if you're dealing with commercial product use, the risk increases even more so, because you might be faced with the destruction of that stock, but also then asked to pay reparations to a copyright holder. It's also important to remember that an orphan status isn't fixed. We have an example where Te Papa holds 25 works by the English painter and etcher Gerald Brockhurst. Back in 2007, they were assessed and deemed to be still in copyright. And we conducted various avenues of research to locate the current copyright holders. Emails and correspondence were sent to known copyright agencies, galleries, museums, and other institutions, which held the same works. But there was no hearing back from anyone. And when we did send out mail, it came back to us unopened. We considered the works orphaned and published these to our collections online, hoping that a copyright holder might come forth. We later then had a research project, which we performed an additional search for the copyright holder and found that the Tate Gallery in London had started reproducing works on their collections online. So we sent out another inquiry to the Tate, and our license was then forwarded on to the current copyright holder. And then after navigating some time differences and technology, the copyright holder agreed to sign our license, which meant that we could continue to use these images legally on all of our platforms. Now, the process for establishing a collection item is in fact an orphan, can take anywhere from a few hours to months and even years. And generally, Te Papa and other institutions try to seek guidance and reassurance from each other, but our policies and processes are no way a perfect solution. I just want to briefly touch on external images, because what happens when you want to use an image from outside of your organization or collection? This can be relatively straightforward, especially if you're using an image from an open GLAM source or from an image site such as Flickr, where images are clearly marked with a great rights statement. And you'll often know what the reuse restrictions, if there are any, upfront, and there's often no costs. Victoria Leachman created this wonderful blog all about 20 great GLAM institutions where you can download free high-resolution images. And it's a great way of starting off your collection, or starting off finding images where you can 100% know that you're free to reuse them without seeking permission. But what do you do when your designer or curator or external contractor falls in love with an image they found on Google or in the wild on the internet? Google image search is going to bombard you with options, and many of which may not be being used legally. So generally you end up down a rabbit hole of trying to find the original source. And when I mean source, I mean the original creator, the photographer, or the image service that actually released the original image. If you are looking on these kind of things on blogs and websites, you're going to want to look for a photographer's name or an image source. Hopefully they've got it in a credit line, and then conduct additional searches for those. You might be lucky and come across a photographer's website where you're able to then send an inquiry about reuse. Things like newspaper articles often include that dreaded supplied image credit line. For these, you might need to actually go back to the newspaper and ask who supplied them the image, or ask if they can tell you who their image source was. What I would say is don't be afraid to contact someone on social media. If that's your only option, more and more often we're wanting to use content that's local and topical, and that may mean that you are going on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. What I would say is if you do have museum accounts, it's nice to be able to contact people via those because it looks a little bit more official. But personally, I have known to contact people via my own personal accounts. What I do tend to do in those situations is I'll outline my intentions and credentials up front and ask them to get in touch with me via my work email, just so it seems a little bit more legitimate on their end. But I will say I've had a pretty good success rate, especially on image platforms like Instagram, where people are wanting their content up there and they're generally happy that you have come forth and asked them for permission in the first place. There's also some really handy tools which you might not know about for tracking down an image. Google has an inbuilt reverse image search. This means that you can look for the image that you've got, and it will find all of the other options online. So all you need to do is click the camera button next to the search field in Google Images, and that will give you an option to either upload a copy of the image that you've got from your computer or paste in the URL from where you found the image. This will generate similar images or exact images and show you where they're being reproduced. There's other tools which also use similar technology, and my favorite is called TinEye. That has a plugin for your computer, which means that when you're searching, you can right click on the image while browsing, and it will pull up all of the websites where that image is being used. Just remember with these, you're looking for the original source. So things like an image library like Flickr, a museum or gallery or photo archive, anything that's reputable so that when you go and ask them for permission, you can get a high resolution copy and surety that you are asking the right person. Once you have found the source, you'll be able to request permission. Now that may be as simple as sending out an email with an attached license or outlining your license terms. Or if you're dealing with a commercial picture library like Bridgman, it'll just be following the prompts on screen. Just remember, permissions can be a process. It's not a straightforward one, and it is one that you're going to have to work through. Research is always going to require a little bit of lateral thinking, some persistence and perseverance. When you are ready to license, do try and keep it consistent, broad, and wherever possible, future-proofed as possible. And of course, if you are ready to consider orphaning works, you will need to consider that you have done a due diligence search, a risk assessment for your organisation. You might want to implement a takedown policy, or what happens should a copyright holder come forth. And also remember that that status can change, so you are going to want to keep on top of those orphaned works as well. Now, all of that might seem really daunting, but help is always at hand if you need any of it, whether or not that's a confirmation on guidance of copyright status or information on where to find people. While I am unable to give legal advice, I am not a lawyer, I can always point you in the right direction and also give you examples of how Te Papa has approached these situations in the past, or how I would approach situations if I was presented with them. I'm happy to take questions, I think, at the end of the session, so save them up for the end, but until then, ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora. Thanks, Catriona.
No problem.
And Mel, I'm going to throw to you now. So do you want to share your screen?
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for inviting me to this. It's been really great to hear Catriona's talk, and also to see how aligned we are with some things, especially around the need for perseverance and lateral thinking, and the way the process circles around, because it really does. I've entitled this Tips for Locating Rights Holders, or How to Be a Nice Stalker. The reason for the title is actually some feedback we got from one person who was just totally amazed that we'd managed to track them down at all. So we did feel a little bit like stalking at that stage, but positive outcome, we got permission in the end. Just want to make a couple of points before I start. One is that for this talk, I'm using kind of creator to cover authors and artists and everything. And I'm working on a general assumption of 50 years after people have died for a copyright term, which obviously doesn't cover everything, but for the purposes of this talk, that's what we're working with. You'll see in the chat that I have put a link to a Stuff article today, which is talking about the new agreement between the UK government and the New Zealand government. One of the consequences of that is that the copyright term in New Zealand is going to be extended by 20 years. And also performance and artist rights are going to be increased in some undefined way at the moment. So of course that will have implications for all of us. And as Catriona said, you know, you're often dealing with the third generation of a creator. With 70 years, that's going to push that even further out. So it'll be an interesting time. Second thing is, I do have a lot of links in this presentation, but I've provided them to Victoria as a Word document. Yep. And so we can send that out after the talk if people are interested. And the third thing I will say is that I had done this talk focused both on how to find creators' death dates as well as how to find people. On Tuesday, I rewrote the whole thing, and it's much more focused now on how to look, some tips about locating people. But if you are interested in also how to work out when someone has died, which of course is a large part of the copyright work, do please maybe give me a wave in the chat so I can get a sense of how many people are interested, and I will try to incorporate that in. Right, now this is my version of a very similar flowchart to Catriona's, except hers is much clearer. The reason I'm sharing this unreadable one for you guys is really that I just want to make the following point. This bit, asking for permissions, is really the straightforward bit, comparatively. This bit, trying to work out if something is in copyright and who owns the rights. And then this bit, trying to track down someone. Those are the things that actually take a huge amount of time. And I just want to reinforce that because often in my experience, the amount of time that's taken in a project situation, for example, isn't recognized. So I just also had some thoughts about what you need to do before you start doing the research. Catriona again has covered a lot of them in terms of thinking about what you want at the end of the process so that you know what you're asking for up front. One thing I would say with Creative Commons is to make sure that you understand them well enough to explain to people, because particularly when you get outside the kind of glam world, you're often talking to people who don't even know what a Creative Commons license is, never mind about what releasing it under just a CC attribution license would mean for their grandfather's work. So I think that's important. The other two things I would say is, you know, understand that rights holders have, they are allowed to ask for money. And if they do, it's a good idea to have already sorted out in your head what your budget and your upper limit is. And the other thing is have backups. People can say no. People do say no. Hopefully not often, but they do. And it's so much easier to have a backup than to try to be clearing an image the day before the book has to go to China to the printers. Okay, so there are basically two scenarios here. One is that the creator of whatever it is you want to use is still alive. The other one is that they're dead and that you're now looking for a descendant. If people are alive, as Catriona mentioned, white pages are still incredibly useful. Google, always Google. I find I get a better result if I can put in the person's name and also another term, maybe, you know, either that they're an artist or a photographer or their location in New Zealand, something like that. And I mean, I've found people just by Googling, because maybe they've made a submission to something under the Resource Management Act, and that submission has been released publicly, and because you need to provide your current address for that kind of thing, there it is online. So it's definitely always worth doing. If it's a published item, check with the publisher first, because even if the publisher's rights have expired, they're still likely to know where the creator is or who is managing the creator's rights. Again, covering something that Catriona has also said, see who else holds a collection of the creator's work. If they have a large collection, they're likely to have contact details, so make the use of that. Current electoral rolls, also still helpful, not digitized unfortunately, but you can still view them. Most local libraries will have copies of at least the local electoral rolls, and the local registrar of electors will also hold them, and National Library has a complete set that can be consulted. For people who haven't used the electoral rolls, it lists people in the electorate by surname, and that provides their current address and also their occupation, which is really helpful for narrowing, you know, if you've got 5 John Smiths, to be able to narrow it down to the John Smith you want. As again, I feel like I'm repeating a lot, sorry Catriona, but as Catriona said, social media also works really well. LinkedIn is quite good for contacts. The example I have here is just a direct message I sent someone on Twitter trying to find their photograph, and that worked well. We got the photograph and the permission we needed. I tend to use social media mostly to try and establish contact, so to get an email address or a phone number that I can then have a longer conversation with the person. The other thing that we've done in the past is that if we've come to this kind of stage where we can't track someone down, sometimes it's worth putting something on your social media page about the project and the copyright holders that you're still trying to get hold of, and occasionally you'll get a response from a family member or a friend who'll recognize that. So that's another way of doing it. The last thing I'd say is also don't forget your professional and personal contacts. New Zealand is really, really small. And I mean, my example that I use here is a couple of years ago, I was talking to a colleague about someone we couldn't track down. Another colleague overheard the conversation. It turned out that she was close friends with the daughter of the person we were trying to find. So she was able to send her friend an email, and we had, direct contact. So all of these things play a role. I just had a couple of other suggestions. I also use the New Zealand Companies Office a lot, not just for directors of companies, but also you can, sometimes if people are shareholders or directors, even if it's not the company that you're interested in, but you're trying to locate a person, sometimes it's worth it because they might be a director or a shareholder in something that you're not aware of, and their contact details or at least an address are provided. This is my brother, in case you're wondering. Sometimes the address will be the company address or the law firm address that handles the business of the company, but that still gives you somewhere to go. FindNewZealandArtists.org is, I'm not sure if people are aware of that, but it's a collaboration between Auckland Art Gallery, Christchurch Art Gallery, and Auckland Museum Libraries. It has useful biographical details if they know them. In this case, this is my mother and they don't. But the other really useful thing is that they list the institutions that hold files on those artists. So again, it's another way of finding out what other GLAM institutions you could approach to see if they have contact details. The other thing, of course, is professional organisations, places like the Publishers Association, New Zealand Society of Authors, Institute of Professional Photography. These are just a few examples. I have much more in my handout if people are interested. Again, they might not be able to provide, because of privacy, they might not be able to provide you with contact details, but often they're happy to pass your request on. Oops, excuse me for a minute. Good. Okay, so the next bit is the bit where unfortunately the creator of the work is no longer alive, but the work is still in copyright. And this is generally a two-step process. One is to work out who manages the creator's rights and then work out how to contact them. Although that sounds very linear, like Catriona's diagram, which I totally intend to steal at some stage with credit, of course, it's much more like this. So, but we'll start with some ideas anyways. If hopefully, if people are a well-known creator, they might have sorted out the management of their rights before they died. I guess Rita Angus is one example. If you do a Google search on Rita Angus and copyright, one of the top hits you'll get is the estate of Rita Angus and their website, which contains contact details and how to apply for permissions. So that's why I think Googling things is always really useful as a first step. If not, if they're well-known New Zealanders, I'd suggest looking at to see if they're in the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography. Won't tell you who manages their rights, but it will give you biographical information about who they married, if they had children, all of these things that will help start your journey to find someone to talk to. And I would say for overseas, there are equivalents like the Australian Dictionary of New Zealand, I was going to say the Australian Dictionary of New Zealand Biography. The Australian Dictionary of Biography, you know, has a similar online search that you can use. Catriona mentioned probates. So just as another aside, family, what we're really getting into here in a lot of ways is family history research. And if that's not something you've done a lot of, then I do recommend looking at the various family history guides that libraries and also Archives New Zealand have put out, because they're very helpful. They'll give you a steer. National Library and Archives New Zealand both have guides on also whakapapa research and Pacific Island family research. So again, you know, other guides to look at. In terms of probates, yes, if you can find someone's will, it does often give you a really good steer on who inherited, where those rights might now be sitting. So probates are the way to find someone's will. Not every estate will go to probate, so you won't necessarily, it's not a guarantee that you'll find a will this way. But if they did, a copy of the will be in the documentation, and they become publicly accessible as part of the probate process. So probates are either held at Archives New Zealand, or if the person's died less than 25 years ago, but before 2013, they will be at the High Court closest to the place they died. After 2013, all the probates are with the Wellington High Court. And if you go to the justice.gov.nz link that I've posted there, they will step you through the process. Archives are working with Family Search at the moment to digitise probates and make them freely available online. The trouble for copyright work is they're only doing probates that are older than 50 years. So it's given that what we're looking at is things newer than that, it's, yeah, not necessarily going to be that helpful. But you can always go and view the physical files at Archives if you find it, or you can request a copy from Archives or the High Court. Both of those have a cost though. So, and with this talk, I guess I'm assuming that most people are working for organisations like mine, where we don't have a lot of funding for research, and trying to do things as for free as much as we can is, you know, so the point of that is that we tend to only go and get a copy of a will if we really have to, if we're kind of at the stage of really not being able to find a person. The will on the right is one of my great-grandfathers, and it just and it turns out he left all his property to his wife, so that was nice and simple. Okay, so these are some more family history sources. Births, deaths and marriages, Catriona mentioned. With BDM historical records, you can actually find out quite a lot of useful information without actually having to purchase the copy of the death certificate or the birth certificate. If you look in the registration number, you'll see the first 4 digits are the year, and that is the year that the birth was registered or the death was registered. And normally that's enough for copyright for you to be able to make a decision at least about whether something is in or out of copyright. And so all of that is available online. Historical electoral rolls. I talked about current electoral rolls earlier. Historical ones, Ancestry has digitized some of them and they're available online. And I'll talk in a little bit about access to Ancestry and how ways you can do that. Your local library is likely to have a huge amount of sources for family history, which might still be on microfiche or card indexes, but still incredibly helpful. A couple that the National Library have biographical files, which are on microfiche, which are basically copies of people's obituaries organised by year and by surname. And a couple of the other major libraries around the countries have copies of those as well. And there are also things like birth, deaths and marriages indexes, which will give you the date so that you can then go and find the notice in the paper. Again, digitized newspapers, really helpful up to a certain period. We've only just moved past 1950 on papers past, so we're up to 1961 for the press now. So as that increases, people's access to be able to find obituaries and stuff should increase. There's also overseas equivalents, of course, Trove, Chronicle in America, the British Newspaper Archive. So don't feel limited if you suddenly think, oh, they're overseas. The other thing to keep in mind is access to contemporary papers. Things like Press Reader will hold most of the major New Zealand papers for 90 days. There are also databases like the Australia and New Zealand News Stream, which have our major papers going back to 95, 97, 1995, 1997. Your local library will often provide access to readers for free to those databases, and certainly places like the National Library do. In Wellington, I can access those databases just by logging on with my library card to the Wellington City Library website, and then be able to freely search. So they're really, really useful sources. These ones, so this is, I mentioned Ancestry earlier. So there are lots and lots of businesses these days that provide access to family history research and places where people can start building their own family trees. And all of that is really hugely helpful for copyright researchers. They, of course, do have a cost. Again, lots of libraries will provide access to for free if you're a reader. So I really recommend seeing what your local library has. There's also, often you can get enough from what they make available online without needing to buy a subscription. So legacy.com provides obituaries. There's a cost, a subscription cost to be able to see all of it, but quite often you can see enough with what they make available online to give you a sense of who the immediate family was and a date, so it's always worth just having a look around. Also, some of these sites will allow you limited access if you sign up, or they'll offer you partial access, so it's a model to try and get you to get a full subscription. But often for this type of work, you don't need that. Okay, so that's not the slide I was expecting. So all of the sources above really were directed to trying to help you find the children or the grandchildren of the creator that you're interested in getting permission for. Once you have a person identified, you go back to the beginning and you start trying to find them in the white pages or the electoral rolls or on Google so that you can establish contact. But as we've mentioned before, it's not usually a linear process. So yeah, it just works in circles. Although the focus of this Zui, it felt to me, was very much kind of around doing this research yourself. But I thought I should mention the rights management organisations as well. So these are some of the major ones in New Zealand here. This is another way of obtaining licenses, and whether you go there or not really depends, I think, on what you're doing, what sort of project you're working on, what your budget is. You know, the point of these organisations, of course, is to, among other things, offer their members an income, or as income stream at least. So you would be expected to be paying for a licence. But for some things like film and music, particularly when there are multiple rights involved, this might be a more straightforward way of going. I haven't actually, if anyone else has heard, I'd love to know if anyone's ever done a kind of cost comparison between, you know, paying for a license in a rights management organisation compared to the staff time and possible fees that happens if you do it yourself. So if anyone has heard of something like that, do let me know, because I'd be fascinated to see where the balance is. And again, as I think Catriona mentioned, in the end, you will end up on the phone saying to someone, "Excuse me, but are you so-and-so's grandson?" And if you're lucky, they will say yes. If you're unlucky, they will say, "Oh, no, you wanted my cousin, but he died 5 years ago." And then you are looping back to trying again. But that's what I have. Happy to have any questions, either about specific resources or just general questions.
Thanks, Mel. I just see that there are a few people that have expressed interest in that border application, as you mentioned earlier, and a question from Susie around the handout. We will send it to everybody that's registered. So we'll do that within the next couple of days. So look out for that in your inbox. But yeah, happy to take any other questions. And also, Catriona and Mel, I'm assuming we'll be able to share your presentations as well. Kapai?
Kapai, definitely.
I might just take a couple of my notes out.
Oh, sweet as. Yeah. No worries. Yeah.
But yes, absolutely. Okay. Happy to make them available.
Very good. Okay. Oh, and then there was just one around asking you, Mel, if you could share the link to the staff article, but I think it is earlier in chat. If you scroll up,
yes,
no, you shared that right at the beginning.
Yeah,
so
you should see it right at the top. Yep.
Yeah. But we'll put that in the notes as well that we send out.
It's also in, you know, the Herald's also running a story on it and stuff. Yeah. So the copyright bit is a very small paragraph within quite a large story that's more focused on the farming information. I'll just resend that link.
Yep. There it is. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, well, we're 5 to 1, so I think we'll wrap up there. Look out for those presentations and links in your inbox. Thanks everybody for attending, and I will close with karakia. E rongo. ko te rongo a whare, ko te rongo a marae, ko te rongo a te hā, ko te rongo maiwhiti, kia hau mai ko te rongo, ko te mau a rongo, ko te rongo mau, e rongo, whaka iatia, ki runga, kia tina,
Tēnā.
hui e,
Tai
hui
kia.
Thank you.
Kia ora, thanks everybody.
Kia ora, thank you,
Lovely
everyone.
to see you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you soon at our next Zoom Hui. Reminder, if you have any ideas for Zoom Hui, please fire them our way. We're very happy to put them on our list. NSTP is committing to 1 Zoom Hui per month, but we will also, happily do more if there are requests that that are more urgent than others. Otherwise, we'll just put them on our list and churn through them. See everybody. Ka
Kia ora.
kite.
Ka kite.
Kia ora, Mel and Catriona.
Kia ora.
So
Ka kite.
appreciate your presentation today. It was really awesome. And yeah, we'll see you soon,
Happy
hopefully.
to do them. I'll make sure I send out all of the resources to you, VE, to send out later in the day.
Yeah, and we'll
Ka
send the
kite.
link to everybody. Ka kite.
Perfect. See ya.